Well, Jim, that's it for the questions this week. We'll see how we're doing with time. Maybe we'll get a song or two, but right now it's time for another watch along. And this is one I'm really excited about because the Midnight Express Houston, Texas matches from 1984 are all amazing. And this is really this is really the first high profile match you guys had in Houston.
Yes, it was. As a matter of fact, and Houston was a great place to work because the town, Paul Bosch had really taken good care of that town. The people loved wrestling. They were hot. They were wild. They saw the TV. They knew what was going on. It was a great building for wrestling. So and also, with the exception of the big Oklahoma City houses and the Superdome shows, this was our big payoff. Houston was the best town consecutively. Houston was the best town usually for houses and payoffs. And it had been that way on and off most of the time through the whole history of the Texas territory. But in this particular instance, Bill Dundee had started as booker in December of 83. All the Memphis crew, myself, the Midnight, Rock and Roll, Terry Taylor, Buddy Landell, had come down and started at the end of the year. But Houston was still a kind of a standalone city in that Paul Bosch still had influence. He still brought in Bockwinkel, who owned part of the town still at this point. We've told that story before. Nick Bockwinkel had bought into Houston. He wanted to retire there and take over from Bosch running the town. Unfortunately, the changes in the wrestling business, by the time that he retired, there was no town of Houston to run.
Plus, around the time he bought in, Bill Watts bought in. So now you didn't just have Peter Burkholz and Paul Bosch as your partners. It was Peter, Paul, Nick, and Bill Watts.
Peter, Paul, and I wish they'd have had a partner named Mary. That would have been classic. But this was still at the point where Paul was bringing in talent that, as he always had done, that was specific to Houston. You mentioned we worked on a show with Black Gordman and the Great Goliath there early on. Bockwinkel was still defending the AWA title on some of these shows. Tito Santana was Paul liked to bring in guys that appealed to the Hispanic audience in Houston that didn't work the rest of the territory. That's one of the reasons why JYD was so over in Houston before Watts even bought in and brought the Mid-South talent over, because Paul had been bringing JYD in to Houston just to do shots. So anyway, having said that, business was down everywhere in the Mid-South territory at the end of 83. That's why Watts had done the talent trade with Jarrett and come to Memphis looking for new talent. That's why they changed to bookers. That's why he had, done all this that he had done to later on in the year make Houston a more Mid-South town. Paul didn't bring in as many outside talents going forward as he had in the past. And part of the reason was because in 84, we did such huge business with the regular Mid-South crew. He didn't need to. The two biggest gates in the Sam Houston Coliseum history of Paul Bosch's promotion were both drawn in 1984, and the Midnight Express were in the main event of both of them. So business had been down. The house, December 30th, 1983, with Bockwinkel versus Wrestling 2 for the AWA title in the main event, the house was only $29,000. And for Houston to be doing, and that's, in those days, that's around 4,000 people at those ticket prices. But that was not good for Houston. So when we started, they flew us in to do a TV taping the day before Thanksgiving 1983. We did 2 matches, 2 weeks of TV. 2 weeks later, they flew us down to Shreveport, and we did 3 more matches, which was 3 weeks of TV, counting the special holiday episode they were doing. And then we started the territory full time, and we made 2 appearances in Houston on the underneath cards to get wins. So when we finally got a main event, which was with Wrestling 2 and Magnum T.A., who were the Mid-South Tag Team Champions at the time, but this was a non-title match. And the reason was because we were milking the idea, since the Midnight Express were unheard of in Mid-South wrestling. The people of Mid-South and Houston, Texas had never heard of Jim Cornette, Dennis Condrey, or Bobby Eaton until they saw us on Mid-South TV around Thanksgiving. We had 5 weeks of wins on television. And then we came to Houston and we had 2 shows where we won underneath matches. And we needed to prove ourselves, according to Wrestling 2 and Magnum T.A., before they'd give us a title shot. So that was the way that they were building this, to where finally we would embarrass them. We kept calling them chickens, saying they were chickens not defending the titles against us. We would finally, after this match we're going to watch in the middle of February, do an angle on TV where we tarred and feathered Magnum T.A. Actually, it was Cairo syrup and feathers from a pillow. But we feathered him because he was a chicken, and that forced them to have to defend the tag team titles against us. So, yes, we did do 4 shows in Houston. The first match, this one, did $51,000 and between 6,000 and 7,000 people. 2 weeks later, we were back at this one. I'll give you the finish ahead of time. They get disqualified. The baby faces. Then 2 weeks later, we came back in another non-title match, and that was when we got disqualified for throwing powder in Wrestling 2's eyes, and then almost started a riot by getting heat on both of them, and Paul Bosch had to come out and tell me to get the fuck out of there. Then we came back 2 weeks later and had another match where this time, I believe it was no disqualification and it was non-title, and we beat them. And then we had a 4th match, which was for the title, and they slipped over us. And then the turn was done where 2 walked out on TA when we won the belts from them in Lafayette, Louisiana, and they never got any more rematches. But for those series of matches in Houston, we did between $50,000 and $60,000, which had basically doubled the business that they were at 2 months previously. And in 2 months' time from that, we would do the last Stampede match where we did over $100,000 and the biggest crowd that ever saw wrestling in the Sam Houston Coliseum. So this was part of the building of the business overall, from where it had been the change of the talent. Watts's old crew moved some guys out, got some new blood in. And this is what I mean when I say you can get guys with talent over if you present them the right way. And they had never seen us in Houston past, like I said, the 5 weeks of TV, and then another couple weeks on TV while we were starting the angle with 2 and TA. We got a little bit of heat on them in one TV segment. This is why they jump us. They come in the ring and jumpstart us on this one because they were mad at what we'd done to them on TV. And the people in Houston wanted to kill us because I had been talking them over and they'd been beating people. And that's how you get new talent over. They come in and they beat somebody on TV every week, and their manager or themselves, if they talk for themselves, tells the people how great they are. And then you pull the trigger on an angle where you put them in with guys that are already established main event talent, and you theoretically sell tickets to that. That's exactly what we did here. And it's not like we had, as I said, a long history in Houston, because they'd never seen us before the fucking Thanksgiving, and this is the end of January. And we've just jumped the house $20,000 from what it was 2 months before. So what was the card that night? Brian, you've got that in front of you. What was the entire card this particular night of this match we're going to watch?
I do have the card, but quickly, let me just mention you were in Houston twice before this. December 30th, 1983, the Midnight Express defeated Lanny Poffo and Rick Rude.
Yep.
And then January 13th, 1984, the Midnight Express defeated Lanny Poffo and El Bracero. So those were the 2 matches in Houston.
El Bracero was a guy named Jose Martinez, and I couldn't believe that we were wrestling him because he was a job guy when I started watching Bruiser's TV show in Indianapolis. Indianapolis had a huge Hispanic population even back then, and he always used Hispanic wrestlers underneath in preliminary matches, including Blackie Guzman. I don't know how he ended up there, but Blackie Guzman, I think it was the same one, the fucking huge lucha heel by the 1970s, was an old broken down Mexican guy doing preliminary matches in Indianapolis. So I'd seen Jose Martinez, El Bracero on TV, and we show up in Houston and we're wrestling him. I'm like, what the fuck? What is this? But that was Paul always wanted to put extra Hispanic guys on the card in Houston to draw, and he was still doing that until, as I said, when this business took off, he just went completely with the entire Mid-South crew. He didn't need to bring anybody else in because they were doing record business.
Here is the card. January 27th, 1984, the Sam Houston Coliseum, Houston, Texas. Masao Ito defeated John King.
Masayo Ito was about to leave for Memphis. That was one of the guys that Jarrett got in the trade, along with Rick Rude and Jim Neidhart and Hacksaw Higgins. John King didn't go anywhere else. Poor fella.
Brian Adias defeated Hacksaw Higgins.
Adias was on loan from Dallas, and Hacksaw Higgins was about to go to Memphis.
Terry Taylor defeated Tom Lintz.
Tom Lintz was a big, bald-headed guy, nice guy. They used him underneath there. He was, good, big, athletic, rugged-looking guy, but he was just there to put Terry over because Terry was just starting like we were.
A battle of the former tag team champions. Jim Neidhart defeated Butch Reed via disqualification.
And this one, Neidhart and Butch had been the tag team champions, as you said, and then Neidhart switched babyface on Butch. They broke up. And the rib was, in those days, when you did an angle in Shreveport on TV, it took 5 weeks for that show to go completely all around the territory. Because 1 week the TV show would air in New Orleans and Baton Rouge and Biloxi, and the next week it might air in Lake Charles and Lafayette and Houston, and the next week it might air in Little Rock and Greenville, Mississippi, and Jackson, Mississippi. And finally, by the time it got to Oklahoma, it was 5 weeks. Because that way you could always have your house show right in the town, right behind your hot angle on TV, right? It was staggered all around. So anyway, poor Neidhart, because Watts was such a stickler, it had been done. He and Butch had split up. Neidhart had become a babyface. But it hadn't shown all over the territory yet. So since it had happened, Watts wasn't going to pretend like it hadn't happened as far as kayfabe was concerned. So Neidhart couldn't dress with the baby faces because the people in different towns hadn't seen him switch babyface, but he couldn't dress with the heels because it had taken place that he and Butch were mad at each other. So Houston was one of the towns that for a period of about 3 weeks, Neidhart had to dress in broom closets. He had broom closets, fucking audio rooms, wherever they had an extra room. Neidhart was all alone. It was like he was in solitary because he couldn't be with the heels because they had broken up, but he couldn't be with the baby faces because the people hadn't seen it on TV and they wouldn't understand it.
Also on this show, Jose Lothario defeated Black Gordman.
And Jose was huge in San Antonio and Houston, even though he was from San Antonio. And that's another guy Paul used to like to bring in because he'd been huge at a drawing card in Houston for 20 years.
Also on the show, besides the Midnight Express versus Magnum T.A. and Mr. Wrestling 2, the main event, a loser leaves town elimination match. Crusher Darso, Butch Reed, and Nikolai Volkov, Butch Reed wrestling twice on this show, defeated the Junkyard Dog, Tito Santana, and the loser, who has to leave town, Hacksaw Duggan.
Well, and that didn't last long. I can't even remember how they got out of that. How did they get out of that?
I don't remember.
Because Tito never came back. There was another Tito. Paul brought Tito in. They liked Tito, but they didn't need Tito anymore. I don't know how they did that. Well, anyway.
Yeah, I'm looking at the results here. Hacksaw Duggan's not on Houston shows for... I'm trying to see when he returns. Looks like he returns in April.
You know what? I'm trying to remember, did they do a deal where they sent him over to the... Well, Dog went to the Carolinas when he became Stagger Lee. He went to the Carolinas for 6 weeks. They may have done... Did Duggan go to Florida at that point for shots? I can't remember. Anyway, we're not talking about Duggan today. We're talking about us. the point is, as you can see, this was kind of the match that had some heat and had, the people's attention, and we were programming going forward. The other matches were kind of cleaning up some of the talent that was leaving and changing the pairings and everything. And as I said, January 27, 1984, the house was $51,000. That's between 6,000 and 7,000 people. And because we had already pissed them off on television, the baby faces hit the ring hot and jumpstart us. And I have not watched this thing all the way through, probably since it happened. And we're going to do it right here in front of God and everybody, right here today.